Okay, friends, so today we are going to be talking about Greek mythology and science. We're going to do our introduction. We'll talk about mythology and history. Then we'll talk about Greek mythology and science. We'll do our activities and we'll go over our resources. And we don't have anybody new today, I don't think, so we're going to skip over this part, but I'm going to say it the right way this time. I'm Megan, I'm not Aiden, so got mixed up last time, but I'm still Megan. And we're doing these STEM classes to connect with each other and to learn new things. Okay, so mythology and history. First, we're going to talk about what is a myth. So there's two different meanings to this word, and the one that we're going to focus on is the traditional, or like the old kind of standard way we mean it. And that means it's a story, and it's a story that is about the early history of a people or a culture. And they usually explain some sort of thing. We call it a phenomenon, so a natural or social phenomenon. Basically, they're explaining something about the world around them or about why things happen. And they usually involve supernatural beings or events. So supernatural beings are like gods or monsters or things like that. So an example could be a dragon in a myth. And nowadays, a lot of times when we talk about myths, what we mean is that it's an idea or a thought that people have that a lot of people think is true, but actually isn't true. So myths are more of a traditional story, like an old story might explain how the sun moves across the sky. A myth might, but a modern myth might be something that is, so a modern myth is widely believed, but isn't really true. So an example of a modern myth is that sugar makes you hyperactive. So sugar doesn't actually make you hyperactive, but a lot of people think that's true, even though it's been scientifically proven to be false. So these are the two different meanings of myths, but we're going to focus on the traditional ones that tell a story that explains the world around us. So mythology is a collection of those stories, and they usually belong to a specific religion or cultural tradition. So in this time, we're going to talk about Greek myths, and specifically ancient Greek mythology. So it means that these stories about the world around them come from a long time ago in Greece. Mythology can also refer to studying myths. So there are people who, for academic reasons or at like colleges and universities, study myths and try to interpret them or basically figure out what the meanings are and then help us understand them. But we're going to focus on the collection of them today. So what's the purpose of myths? Myths are stories that help explain the world around us. So a lot of times myths are a story of the gods, or they might be a religious explanation of something like the beginning of the world or creation. They might explain big events or kind of big things that the gods did that created the world or nature or like other things.
The sea or thunder.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. So in these pictures above, you can see there's examples of myths from every culture that we can think of. So it expresses or it tells and it confirms or proves true whatever that group of people think about their values and their norms. So it basically helps everybody in that community to understand why they should behave a certain way and make sure that they're all sharing the same kind of feelings and thoughts about how things started. And what that does is it helps bring people closer together. And that was really, really important, especially a really long time ago when humans were kind of living in small tribes and needed to rely on each other to survive. So there's examples of these in each culture. You can see there's a Norse myth here about a god breathing life into things. There's old Native American myths about crows creating the world. And then here's another one about a horse and a tree. So there's a lot of different ones from different cultures, kind of all over the place. The ones we're going to talk about today, though, are from ancient Greece. And when I say ancient Greece, I mean about 900 to 800 BC or BCE, which is when these things kind of originated. So ancient Greece, as a culture, was around for a really, really long time. But they started to develop the alphabet in about 800 BCE. And so that's when they started to be able to write down their stories. And a lot of our sources for things like this were actually written down, or they were drawn on like pots or decorated on things. And a lot of these stories have kind of persisted or stayed with us. Greek myths and Greek culture have had a huge impact on the Western world today. So especially during the period known as the Renaissance, when lots of painters and things and poets were very active in Europe, they drew a lot from ancient Greek history to paint their pictures and to make their sculptures. So a lot of the pictures that we're going to see are from that period of time. And I want to explain how long ago this was. So we keep track of history and we keep track of time in a very specific way. So when we started keeping track of time, that's supposedly year 1. And years before that are referred to as BCE, or before the Common Era, and years after year 1 are the Common Era. So we're in the Common Era right now, and we're in the year 2020. So 2020 years ago, we started keeping track. Now I tell you this because we're 2,000 years away, 2,000 years plus away from the year 1, right? And when we go back to our ancient Greek timeline, remember I said it's 900 to 800 BCE? Well, here's year 0, or year 1. So not only are we 2,000 years in the future from here, but we're another 800 to 900 years away from when these stories came from. So these stories are close to 3,000 years old, and we still know about them today, which is super cool. And when we talk about ancient Greece, we're also talking about a specific area. So the Greek islands and the Greek land had a lot of different areas, but the ones that we hear about a lot are things like Sparta, Thebes, Athens, Delphi, where the some of the people that could tell the future were supposed to live. Yep, Crete. There's Crete down here. And also Mount Olympus was believed to be here. So these areas had really important significance, or they meant a lot to these different people, and they told their stories about these areas in which they lived. So what happened to all these myths? I know they're 3,000 years old, but why don't we still basically believe in them? And the answer is that myths actually stuck around in our culture as sacred or religious stories. So a sacred story or a sacred thing means that it's not supposed to change over time, and it maintains a lot of importance to a culture. So we kept these myths around as like basically religious stories that tell history. Audiences were also lost. An audience is someone who receives or who hears a story or a thing. And regimes or leadership changed. So the Greek islands are not, or the Greek area is not still led by, you know, the same people that it was back then. So actually the Romans came in and conquered the area, and now we have, then Christianity came, and now we have modern thought and modern government. So during those time periods, the Romans came in and kind of shoved all the Greek stuff away and renamed it whatever they wanted. So they kept the basics of it, but they renamed everything. And then Christianity kind of changed things as well. And then in the 16th and 17th century, the church, the Catholic Church specifically, started to really try to kind of stomp out the new science that was coming out. So people like Copernicus, pictured here, were coming out with a lot of new theories about how the world worked. They were saying, you know, the Earth is actually round, and it was created a certain period of time ago, and it wasn't created in 7 days. And they were saying that we orbit around the sun, and the church forbid that. They called those people heretics. And so they kind of tried to stomp out science. But even though that happened, kind of this war between science and religion, science actually kind of persisted and replaced mythology. So we kind of, as a people, didn't really need these stories anymore because we had a scientific explanation that we were accepting. So now with that, we're going to talk about some of the myths and their basis in science. So one of the big ones is Helios. Does anybody know who Helios is?
Titan of the sun.
Yes, exactly. So Helios is the god in the personification of the sun. And personification means we take something that isn't like a person or doesn't have feelings or thoughts, and we kind of pretend that it does, basically. We put our thoughts and feelings onto it. So we said that the sun is actually a god, or they said the sun is actually a god called Helios. And in art, as you can see here, he's usually shown with a crown that kind of glows, and he's driving a horse-drawn chariot through the sky. And the idea was that he drove the sun across the sky every day, and then he kind of circled around the world and returned to the east at night. And the Greeks used this as a way to explain why the sun rose and set. And as you can imagine, if you don't have like scientific basis or like the math to explain why you think the earth rotates around the sun, or you don't have things like telescopes or binoculars or anything like that, you would make up a story about what happens. And so the story in ancient Greece was that Helios was actually pulling the sun on a chariot around the world. And one of the famous stories about Helios is that his son, Phaeton, tried to drive his father's chariot, but he lost control of it, and he actually set the earth on fire. And Zeus had to come in and interfere, and he threw a thunderbolt at Phaeton and killed him instantly. And he did that to save the world. So some of that might explain stories about wildfires or thunderstorms, because it was really difficult to understand them from a scientific standpoint. And if you think about it, things like that are still kind of scary today, right? Like I live in California, and right now there's a lot of wildfires and lightning. And if I didn't have somebody else to explain them to me, or I hadn't grown up learning what I have, I might think that, you know, there was a God in the sky doing it too. So it's not that these people weren't smart. They just had different stories about how things were happening, and they didn't have access to things like the scientific method and all the knowledge that we have today. So another one is Scylla. Yes, Aiden.
Oh, I was gonna say that eventually Apollo replaced Helios
Mm-hmm.
when the god of the sun. Yeah.
Yes, he did. So that happened a little bit later, where people started to kind of confuse the two, but the original god of the sun was actually Helios. And then people started to associate it with Apollo. So good call, buddy. So another one you might have heard is Scylla. And we usually talk about Scylla in conjunction with Charybdis, but I'll go into Charybdis in a little bit. So this myth of Scylla was in an epic tale, which basically means like a long and amazing story called the Odyssey that was written by Homer. And it talks about an area in the sea with a channel, which is like a narrow strip of water between two kind of points of land. And in this channel, on one side, there was a monster called Scylla. And on the other side, there was a whirlpool called Charybdis. And it looks like I mixed these up a little bit. So the idea is that this channel has a whirlpool and would basically suck in ships that were passing by. So there was also, I'm sorry, this is Scylla. There was also this kind of three-headed monster that was in there, or multi-headed monster. It apparently had 12 legs and 6 necks and a man-eating head with 3 rows of teeth. And it would like suck in sailors when they were going through this channel in these whirlpools. And the idea was that if the monster didn't get you, the whirlpools would get you. So it was very, very dangerous to sail through this channel. And modern scholars think that this is actually the real channel that we're talking about between Sicilia and Calabria. And so when people sail through here today, the water is actually really choppy and fairly dangerous, and there are whirlpools there. So people think that this real channel and then the whirlpool were understood by sailors to be very, very dangerous, but they didn't really understand why, right? So it was actually easier for them to explain that there were these monsters, or there was this like supernatural whirlpool sucking people up. And it was easier for them to blame these accidents of the sailors on the gods. And it was easier for them to kind of live with the loss of for their families and things if they kind of said, well, it's the will of the gods, they got sucked into Charybdis, or Scylla got them. And some of those things could also explain for people back home why sailors didn't come back. So a lot of times if the sailors didn't come back, they just didn't know what happened to them, right? So if eventually sailors come back and say, oh, there was this terrible monster or there was a whirlpool, they might say, oh, that must have been what happened to my husband or my brother or my uncle. And they could use that as an explanation to help them kind of feel better about the situation. And part of the thought behind where Scylla came from, this multi-headed monster, people have thought that maybe they were talking about the Kraken or kind of the giant squid, but those are actually really rare in the Mediterranean Sea. So, I mean, it is possible that they saw them. But it's also possible that people saw animals around this time, especially reptiles that had multiple heads, which is called polycephaly. And it's really rare for it to happen in like humans and mammals, but it happens more often during reptiles. And what happens is, while that baby is growing, something damages it and it causes cells to double up. So it might grow two heads, or it might fuse together two different animals. And so it's thought that maybe
twins, right?
Yep, kind of like that. It's thought that maybe some of these stories come from things like that. There's even a story of Aristotle, who's a famous kind of Greek scholar. He wrote down a story about a two-headed snake in 350 BCE. And
what's the Kraken?
The
Pirates of the Caribbean, right?
Yeah, the Kraken's like a big sea monster that's basically a giant squid that takes down ships.
And it creates whirlpools and stuff, and it sucks ships and eats them.
Pirates of the Caribbean.
Yep, it's in Pirates of the Caribbean. So a lot of these Greek myths are still kind of popular today for storytelling. So we put them in our TV shows and our comics and things like that, because they're very interesting stories and we can relate to them, just like the ancient Greeks did. Another interesting one is called the Lotus Eaters. And I know Aiden and Lizzie kind of know this one, but basically—
I know this one.
You know that one?
It's in Percy Jackson too.
Yes, exactly. So that's why Aiden and Lizzie know this. But the background—
listen to all the audiobooks.
So the background to the Lotus Eaters is that in the Odyssey, winds carry Odysseus and his ship off course, and they get stuck in the land of the Lotus Eaters. The sailors, when they get there, enjoy like the local foods and things so much that they forget about returning home, and they have to be dragged back to their ships to take home, to go home. And there's a lot of theories about where this story comes from. So here you can see him trying to kind of drag everyone back, and then here's all the sailors kind of asleep, basically. And it's actually thought now that the lotus could be a real plant, or it could be something like a really strong wine or a drug like opium. There's another thought that maybe Odysseus and his crew enjoyed the fruit and the hospitality and just being able to eat finally so much that they didn't want to go back because they were really comfortable. And you can imagine if you're at sea for years eating like dried beef strips and drinking like old gross beer and stuff, you probably would be pretty happy to land somewhere and to get food and water and like be able to rest, right? Another thought is that there is a fruit called Sisyphus lotus, and it's a fruit that has psychoactive properties, which means it does things in your mind to like maybe kind of make you see things or maybe be really sleepy or things like that. And it's actually a banned substance in Europe. And so it's thought that maybe this story is based on some sailors that accidentally ate this kind of fruit and then pretty much fell asleep and didn't care to go back to where they came from. So this is another popular one, Cyclops. So the story behind Cyclops is that Odysseus and his crew were searching for supplies on another island, and they run into a big scary guy called Polyphemus. And Polyphemus is a huge giant and he eats people. He has only one eye, but eventually Odysseus manages to blind him by putting a stake through his one eye in the middle. And for animals that have a backbone, so remember phylum Chordata, that have a notochord during development, they get a spinal cord, they have a backbone. It's really uncommon for animals like that to have one eye. We usually call that cyclopia, and it's like a disorder that you're born with, where the orbits or the kind of round holes where your eyes go, they don't really develop into two separate spots. And so you end up with one eye. And that leads to a lot of complications for your brain and your nose and lots of things. So usually if you're born with cyclopia, you don't survive. So it's possible that they were kind of describing some sort of baby that had been born like this, but it's more likely that because we said it was that Polyphemus was a giant, it's more likely that what they were actually seeing was a skeleton. And there are a lot of fossilized remains. So we talk about fossils with like giants or dinosaurs and woolly mammoths and things. There's an actually a type of dwarf mammoth that lived in the area of Greece. And you can sometimes find their skulls and fossils in caves and things around there. So part of the thought is that the island caves, they found these bones. And as you can see from the skull here, there's kind of a big hole in the middle, right? And so especially if like the tusks were maybe missing, you know, they wouldn't know how to put this skeleton back together. So they might have thought that these big holes in the middle were actually for one eye. And that could be where the stories of Polyphemus and the other Cyclops came from. And in like Italy and around there, there's actually a few different species of these dwarf elephants or dwarf woolly mammoths that could have led to people finding these and seeing them. Another myth is Circe. So we all know Circe as a sorceress. She's a witch, right? And in the stories, the adventurers, yeah?
She turns people into pigs.
Yeah, so in this picture, you can see this soldier has been turned into a pig, and there's pigs down here. And Odysseus was, for some reason, protected from her spell. So botanists, or people that study plants, point usually to, or say it's usually Jimson weed, which is a datura species. And it's related to plants called belladonna and deadly nightshade. And what those do is they block some of the chemicals in your brain, and they can cause people to hallucinate or be delirious or even get amnesia. So if somebody was accidentally eating these plants, they might hallucinate that they were in fact turned into a pig or something like that. And so it's thought that maybe some of these sailors accidentally ate this plant, or it got in their food somehow. And then the reason Odysseus didn't get sick is because he ate something that counteracted or stopped that reaction in his brain. And so some researchers think that he ate something called snowdrop, which grows in the region and can kind of stop the effects of the poisoning from this other flower. So it's definitely possible that this story actually came to be because of a real plant. So another interesting one is the cattle of the sun. And you guys probably recognize this from Percy Jackson as well, when Percy has to clean out the stables of all the kind of fiery cattle. So
no, those are horses, man.
Oh, they are horses, you're right.
But there are Apollo's cattle.
Yep, so the cattle of the sun, yep, the cattle of the sun belong to Helios. And Odysseus and his crew kind of landed on this island where the sun god grazed his cattle, and they ran out of food. Odysseus and his crew ran out of food. So they started hunting these cattle when their supplies ran out. And it's thought that this island is actually referring to modern day Sicily, which is a part of Italy. And there's evidence on these islands that there were domesticated cattle, as well as these things called aurochs. And here's an auroch, the wild auroch, which is actually extinct now, but it's like a really kind of basically big cow. It stood about 100 or about 1.5 meters high at the withers, or the tallest part of its back. And it was like kind of large, and it had these big curving horns. And so a lot of these stories about how much the cattle were valued by the Greek gods make sense, because there weren't that many cattle in ancient Greece. Cattle were very highly valued, and before people had like paper money and things like that, having cattle was a big kind of a wealth thing. It emphasized how wealthy you were. So when Odysseus and his crew take the cattle over here, they are actually punished by Zeus, because they took and killed the sun's cattle. And Zeus destroys their ships and their sailors with a thunderbolt, and only Odysseus was said to survive. So this one is another one where it could be based on actual fact of these real cattle that are now extinct, but these real cattle that existed on these islands. So you guys know this one. This is Zeus. And this is a statue of Zeus, and this is Zeus in Hercules from Disney, which is one of my favorite movies, so I had to put that in there. But Zeus is always pictured with his lightning bolt. And that's because he was the father of the gods, but he was also the god of the sky and of lightning and thunder. And you can imagine if, no one had told us any different, what we might think thunder and lightning were. It kind of makes sense to me that I would think some big, huge guy is like stomping around in the sky, right? And throwing lightning bolts down. So that is how the Greeks basically explained some of the scarier weather that we have, is that Zeus was angry. There was also Zeus's brother Hades, and Hades ruled over the dead and the underworld, and also of wealth and darkness. So here's Hades from Disney, which is very funny in that, I think.
With his pet Cerberus.
Yep, and there he is with Cerberus. So he's often pictured with Cerberus. And one of the interesting things about Hades is that his name means the unseen one. And he was kind of a ruler of like this invisible world, right? This underworld. So it makes sense that we call him unseen. But the ancient Greeks actually didn't use his name very often because basically it was kind of scary, right? And they didn't want to talk about him. And they also didn't, because he was so like grim and kind of scary and really scared people, he wasn't really put in a lot of art. So people didn't make a lot of statues of Hades or draw him a lot because he was kind of scary. But when we do see pictures or statues of him, he's usually got a beard. He looks kind of sad or angry, and he usually wears a helmet, which is his helm of darkness, or his cap of invisibility. And then he's also usually pictured with Cerberus. And if you remember, Cerberus is the three-headed dog that
guards
kind of
the gates of the underworld.
Exactly. And then sometimes he'll carry a scepter, or he'll hold the keys to his kingdom. But a lot of the statues, yes?
Why is he missing his arm in the statue? Because it probably broke.
Yeah, a lot of old Greek statues that we've found actually were kind of buried underground, or they got covered up, and so parts that are delicate kind of broke off in transit and things. So
Didn't Hades also force, I forget the name of his wife?
Persephone.
Didn't he force Persephone to marry him by like making her eat pomegranate seeds, and then once you eat something in the underworld, you have to stay?
Yes, exactly. So that's another probably origin of a myth about the seasons. Yeah, so when Persephone goes back and she's allowed to travel to the regular world, that's when we have like spring and summer, because she causes all the flowers and things to bloom. And then she has to travel back down to Hades, and that's when we have like fall and winter and everything dies. So that's another very good example, Olivia. I should have put that in, but Persephone and Hades kind of together then are basically the cause of the seasons. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some activities. So for my small friends, you guys can draw a Greek god, or you can draw a myth of your choice. So lots of choices for you. School friends can write a few sentences about mythology. You can create a comic about a Greek god, or you can draw a myth of your choice.
You didn't say anything about any of the other gods, like Poseidon or anything.
I didn't, because otherwise I would talk to you guys about it all day, because it's so interesting.
Yeah.
But I definitely suggest that you guys check out the Percy Jackson series if you find this interesting and you haven't read them yet. And then there's a bunch of cool links and things online as well. There's a lot of Greek mythology books for kids that you can read too. And then for older friends, you guys can write a paragraph about why myths exist. You can create a comic about a myth of your choice, or you can draw a Greek god of your choice and write a sentence about their myth and why it exists. So an example of this would be that you draw Hades and then you explain why the myths around Hades exist. And then I have a lot of resources here for you. There's some cool stories about where myths, legends, and folktales come from. You guys might enjoy some of these. And then there's also some papers that I read that I found very interesting. So I hope that you guys enjoy them.